The ego, persona, the shadow, anima, animus, projections, the more we try to arrive at a simple understanding of these ideas, the more complex the whole matter becomes. We all have an intuitive sense of these things, but the language of psychology sometimes serves more to confuse than to clarify. Besides, if these ideas are constant to the human race, why must we rely on unfamiliar vocabulary to understand them? According to Campbell, we needn't. The archetypes of the unconscious, the universal themes, are accessible to all through the universal language of art. In art, Campbell sees the abstract, elementary ideas take concrete form.
And now I come to another phase of this. Wonderful Dali, in his best period, about 1928, persistence of memory or wet watches. This is the experience of time in the unconscious. We have two systems, the conscious system where time goes tick, 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 and we grow old with it. The other, the unconscious system, who just doesn't know anything about this. And in the late old age, you can have experiences that really are appropriate to much earlier years. So what are you going to do about it? These two systems operating in us. Here is another of his, Dream, inspired by the buzz of a bee around a pomegranate, 1/4 second before waking. This is the pomegranate with the bee. Here is the pomegranate in the dream. The pomegranate is the fruit of the underworld. Psychologically, the unconscious. Out of it come the powers of the underworld. First, the fish that swims in the abyssal waters. Noah did not have to take fish into the ark. The fish is an ever-present power in the abyss of the unconscious. And then the shadow, the threat aspect, pouncing at her. Zoom. That's really right out of Freud. Now, here's the story. When the ego becomes uncertain about its moral position, everything in the psyche begins to move. This happens on campuses. Student A finds herself rooming with student B. Student B comes from a family, let's say, that votes Republican. And student A's family votes Democrat. The families would not speak to each other. They would even burn each other at the stake if they could. And then these students find, oh, this is a perfectly decent person. Their whole moral and theoretical position is loose. And then there takes place two very important movements. Who that? That's me coming up, boy. Eyes your own other side. I call that the knock-knock principle. I once knew a nice little Christian gentleman who said, if I weren't a good Christian, I'd be a terrible person. I asked, well, what do you think you'd do? He didn't know. I said, you're not a danger to society. One can overestimate the threat of one's own shadow. And the other is the allure of the exotic. You see, what's happening is the social bounds, the social right-hand path system is disintegrating. Shadow comes up, and you have the collision of righteous against darkness and so forth and so on. And the other, exotic allure. Oh, for South Sea Island and those hula girls. That I call the twinkle, twinkle principle. And this is what happens. Then the poor man, everything he wants to do, he doesn't want to do. And so he's hanging on more tenaciously than ever to the persona system. So half his energy goes into holding on to what he expects himself to be, and the other into wishing he were something else, and then he experiences depression. No energy for anything except that tension. Now this is the way you feel. This is another Dali, and it's called Premonitions of Civil War, or Soft Composition with Boiled Beans. But I present this for a certain reason. Premonitions of Civil War. The dynamics of the psyche, the dynamics of the society are equivalent. What has been pushed down is going to come up. And there's the tension. And what we were talking about a few years ago, the explosions of the inner city, is exactly the social counterpart of this coming of the shadow up. It's a function of the organism that has not been recognized and given its position. And always out of that comes an enlargement of consciousness, and there has to be an assimilation of the two. Knock, knock, twinkle, twinkle, transformation of consciousness. One comes up against intolerable decisions time and again, and that means that you have not a moral order that actually takes into account the necessities and actualities of life. The prime example in our biblical tradition of the intolerable decision is that of Abraham, invited by his God to kill his son Isaac. That's an intolerable decision. This is an 18th century painter, Fuseli, an Italian painter, and it's called The Nightmare. This is a whole century before Freud and Jung. Artists knew all these things long ago. It's wonderful to read Thomas Mann's paper on Freud and the future. Somebody invited Thomas Mann to give the talk at the party for Freud's 80th birthday. Well, who would in his right mind would invite an artist to talk about anybody but himself? So what Mann really did was talk about himself. But he said the wonderful thing about Freud was that never having read any of the great romantic philosophers, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Schopenhauer, and the rest, he had, out of his own investigations, translated their romantic philosophy into medical language. And then he went on to say, now I, in my work, knew all these things before I ever read Freud's interpretation of dream. And now, of course, you see, doing my Joseph novels, I've moved on to Jung. That was a great talk for Freud's 80th birthday. But here we have it. The artist knew these things. So what's so frightening and terrifying about a horse and a cat? Only what she has projected into the idea, and this is obviously an erotic nightmare of terrifying import.